I got passed over for 2 separate jobs for what feels like a very ridiculous reason. I'm not sure if this fits here or not, but I'm annoyed and angry and I can't fire off my frustration at the proper parties involved. Without giving too much away in case someone at my job were to ever see this post and start making some connections, I've been at my current place of employment for about 3 years. Recently, I've been trying to move to other sections within my department so that I could learn new skills as much as I can before I move on elsewhere. I'd first applied for another position entirely in a different sector of my department earlier this year, and had made it to the interview, but didn't get it. I was just told that the candidate who did get it fit more along with what that area was looking for in an employee, so I chalked it up to the notion that they had more experience than me. Fair is fair, there, and I was disappointed because the position would have given me a bit of a pay bump in the process of learning something new, but I understood what I assumed to be the case, which I'll come back to in a minute. Fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, and a position opened up again in another area of my department. Same job description as what I do now, but entirely different job duties, so it would have just been a sideways transition, but I had to interview for it as opposed to just being placed into it. Made it to the interview, but wound up not getting it either. Again, I assumed that the person who did was just more qualified to do the things they were asking, and was still disappointed, but if it came down to specific qualifications, I understood, even though, as I said, it was the exact same position as what I currently do, but different duties. I later found out that the reason why I didn't get either position is because of what I'd done in the interviews. Prior to the first interview, I'd written down some helpful information to reference based on some of the operations of both the department in general and based on the specific area I was trying to get into. I'd Googled some helpful interview tips, and in each source I saw, LinkedIn, Indeed, ZipRecruiter, to name a few, all stated that having some notes to fall back on makes you appear as though you're really trying your hardest to stand out in the interview as opposed to BSing your answers. Someone on the panel thought differently, however, not liking that I did so, but no one communicated to me after the fact that this was the case, so I wouldn't do it again. I proceeded to reference notes again in the second interview for one of the questions that was asked, and that was my second undoing, because the same person who had an issue with it the first time was also on the second interview panel. So, to recap, I didn't get passed over for both positions because I didn't know the answers to the questions being asked. It wasn't entirely because of my skill level or amount of job knowledge. Again, I've been here 3 years, and certainly know a whole lot more than I did when I first started. It wasn't even because of how I interviewed in general, because they'd all told me that I did a nice job despite being visibly nervous. It was because I utilized notes to keep my nervousness from having me falter on information I actually did know about in some capacity, even if there were certain areas I didn't have hands-on experience with, and because someone dropped the ball after my first interview and didn't warn me about what not to do going forward, making me inadvertently make the same mistake a second time, trying to prepare myself as best as possible in my efforts to move around / up as high and far as I could go given my current skill set. I've been fuming about this since I found out what I found out, and I can't really vent to anyone on the job without making a disappointing situation worse for myself, and, now, any opportunities one had to get out of what I'm currently doing have been filled, with new opportunities being very few and far in between. Unfortunately for me, everyone likes their jobs up here. It's also making it very difficult to maintain a professional relationship with some of the parties involved in this because I find the reasoning to be incredibly petty, and I'm not sure what to do with my feelings. Let me analyze this story for you. This story is a masterclass in quiet professionalism clashing with the arbitrary politics of workplace culture. It's not loud or explosive. It doesn't involve betrayal, abuse, or even direct confrontation, but it captures something deeply relatable and maddening, the experience of doing everything right and still being punished for it. The narrator, an employee of 3 years trying to grow within their department, walks us through a series of job rejections that don't stem from poor qualifications, bad behavior, or lack of initiative, but from something as absurdly benign as using notes in an interview. What emerges is a story of silent injustice, unspoken expectations, and the frustrating opacity of professional advancement. What stands out immediately is the narrator's measured tone. They're not asking for sympathy, and they don't lash out. They lay out the facts, they prepared thoroughly, researched proper interview etiquette from reputable sources, and tried to compensate for nerves with strategic note-taking. The irony is rich. What the internet hails as best practice for job interviews was perceived by at least one panel member as a lack of professionalism or preparedness. This discrepancy between external expectations and internal politics forms the heart of the story's tension. The narrator was penalized not for a failure of competence but for violating an unspoken aesthetic standard, some intangible idea of what confidence and readiness are supposed to look like. But the deeper issue here is not the use of notes. It's the lack of transparency. After the first rejection, no one offered feedback or direction. No one said, "Here's what we'd prefer you do next time." The narrator, trying to be better, simply repeated what they thought worked only to unknowingly commit the same offense twice. This isn't just a personal grievance, it's a systemic flaw in the way many organizations handle internal promotions and employee development. If feedback isn't shared, growth isn't possible. And if a single person's subjective opinion can derail an otherwise strong candidate, the process isn't meritocratic, it's performative. The story also speaks to the silent cost of professionalism. The narrator doesn't rage. They don't burn bridges. They don't scream or demand justice. They internalize the slight, bite their tongue, and continue showing up in the same workplace where they were quietly dismissed, not for their lack of talent, but for a moment of visible preparation. And while they're trying to maintain composure, they're also seething. That contradiction, being expected to stay cordial, helpful, and engaged with people who subtly sabotaged your progress, is what makes this story quietly devastating. There's also something particularly disheartening about how trivial the reason for rejection was. Notes. Notes. The thing that's supposed to demonstrate thoughtfulness, initiative, and humility, willingness to admit you don't remember every single fact in the moment, is turned against them. It speaks to the larger, unspoken culture of many workplaces where appearances, vibes, and unwritten rules matter more than substance. Where being polished trumps being prepared. Where fitting a mold matters more than showing promise. And yet, the narrator shows restraint and resilience. They keep working. They don't implode. But beneath that surface is exhaustion, alienation, and the bitterness that comes from realizing that effort alone isn't enough to move forward. The sadness in the story isn't just about two missed opportunities, it's about how those moments have made the narrator feel boxed in, how the illusion of growth within the organization has cracked, revealing just how arbitrary and politicized mobility can be. If this story has a resolution, it's a quiet one. The narrator will continue, but their trust in the system has eroded. They now know that doing their best won't always be enough. And perhaps, more tragically, they know that authenticity, like using notes to stay grounded, isn't always welcomed in spaces where image is everything. In the end, this isn't a story about rejection. It's a story about disappointment, about what it feels like when the people in charge of your growth decide, silently and subjectively, that you're not the right kind of candidate, no matter how hard you try. And that's the kind of story that lingers. Quietly. Painfully. And all too often.